Great. Well, nice to be here and chat to you guys, and hopefully provide you guys with a different perspective on a creative experience. Certainly multi-sensory and the influence of all those together. And yeah, looking forward to it. But I apologize about my slides design because they're probably it's not my forte compared to everyone else. So I'm starting off. So this is my journey so far, and the icon that you have in front of you is something called an enzo, which in Zen Buddhism is a form of meditation where you draw a circle. And I drew this circle, and it's actually tattooed on my arm. And enzo is really interesting because it's about the journey to enlightenment. And actually, when you create a perfect circle, that's when you've found enlightenment. But often, as with mine, it's not quite perfect and it's not quite touching yet. But it links into probably my favorite of the 9 Japanese definitions of beauty, which is wabi-sabi, which is perfection and chaos. And it really summarizes my journey thus far, insofar that sometimes the situations and the environments that you find yourself in that don't seem perfect end up leading to that perfection. And just like with that circle, it's the small mishaps and the imperfections that create the beauty within it, right? And I think that's really kind of like what has influenced me through my life, and you'll kind of get an understanding of that as we go through. So to kind of kick things off, I was born in Madrid to English parents, and this had a profound influence in my life because my parents had only just moved there. And if any of you are parents, you'll know that a child will always look to its parent for influence. How are they feeling? What's kind of going on for them? So having parents that were, encaptured by this environment they're in, the new sounds, the new smells, the new tastes, that had a huge influence on me as a child. So I was always tasting things, and I was always looking to my parents for that influence, and there was always that excitement. And really, for me, that's kind of what kind of started part of my journey, which is through aroma. And one of the funny things that my parents always say to me is that ever since I've been a tiny kid, I smell everything. I've smelt everything. And really, smell's such an interesting sense, and it's one that we as humans commonly overlook. It's one of the kind of the key parts of the brain that evolves first. Why? Well, because fundamentally, it's one of our key senses to tell what we should and shouldn't put into our mouth. There's a common misconception that human smell is not very poor. That is very poor in comparison, especially to other animals, but that's not quite true. If you take, for example, gas that you'll get from your cooker, the gas itself doesn't actually smell anything, but there is a synthetic aroma in there, which is 1 in 3 billion parts. So for context, if you were to take an Olympic swimming pool and you were to drop 1 pipette of liquid into that swimming pool, the human nose would be able to detect it. So we're much better at smelling than we think. And it's a key component of what we call flavor. So since being a young child, I really started to build up a library in my mind about aromas, which has kind of served, been a key part of what I do as my creative outlet since I was young. Now, as I kind of started to go into adulthood, I started to do all manner of kind of roles, and really kind of started off into hospitality. And doing this particular role as a pot wash. And this is one of those kind of like flat moments where you're in a working environment, you're in an environment, you're like, why am I here? This is definitely the imperfection to the perfection. But one of the things that I started to do from a very young age was look for ways to entertain my mind. And I think many creative people kind of go through this process, whether you were drawing as a kid in the back of the car on a long journey or stuff like that. And for me, one of the things that I became obsessed about when I was washing pots and pans was efficiency, right? And kind of almost looking at this process of a plate or a pot coming in and mapping out that whole journey and looking for ways to make it more efficient. And, just kind of starting to develop this worth ethic that's kind of stayed with me from a young age. And you know, I think the irony is that at certain stages of my professional career, and actually some of the highest positions I've had, I've referenced a lot of the experience that I gathered from this particular moment in time. And so kind of like with this kind of start into the professional world really kind of was the development of the beginnings of my career. And I, at a very young age, at the age of 18, I lied on my CV and said I had bar experience before. And I started working behind bars, and I really enjoyed this because I was quite a shy person. So having that piece of wood between myself and another person allowed me to have a sort of a platform, and it was a certain element of disconnect. I think potentially in another lifetime I could have gone into acting because I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed playing different parts. But this is really where my professional career and my personal enjoyment around food and drink really started to develop. And I went to university in Sheffield and started to make cocktails, and I started to really kind of become quite passionate about it. And I think as a kind of a creative outlet, I started exploring all these different flavors. And for many years, I kind of worked at various different levels. And I worked for quite an infamous bar group called the Match Group that were foundational in developing the cocktail scene within the UK. It was advised by an individual called Dale de Groff, who was the individual that was responsible for really the American cocktail revival. He brought the Cosmopolitan to everyone's attention, and the Rainbow Rooms is where the women from Sex and the City were filmed drinking this. And they started to bring a lot of the kind of a classic ethos of minimalism, but high quality, high levels of training. And the people that kind of came from that bar group ended up opening some of the most iconic bars across the world. And if you look at the world's top 50 bars, I would say that probably 20 to 30% of them have a direct link back to this. As I kind of continued to work within the industry and kind of refine my talents, I realized kind of one of my own kind of unique skills, which is synesthesia. So when I was smelling and tasting things, it became very visual for me. And I started to see flavors as shapes. Now, this is quite common in the world of professional tasters. I'm sure many of you, if I gave you a Coca-Cola and a Diet Coke, you could point to which one was Coke and which one was Diet Coke. But if I was to ask you to describe the difference, if I was to ask you to take Coke, Diet Coke, and then to turn that flavor into that of Coke, it would be very difficult. And there are certain individuals such as Jim Beveridge, who's the master blender of Johnny Walker, who will take tens of thousands of whiskey barrels, all of which taste completely different, and he will blend them together to create a consistent flavor in something like Johnny Walker Black every time. And Jim Beveridge has synesthesia, and when he smells, the aromas that he smells have color. Because I'm sure if I ask each of you to then create orange with a palette of colors, you would be able to do so. So it's this interesting process of turning something like a multi-sensory aspect, be it sound or be it smell, and turning it into something visual, which allows you to kind of give it a much more, make it much more tangible and allow people to kind of start to play with that. So for me, this is all of a sudden, this is when my internal library of aromas really started to develop. And I was constantly smelling things and kind of filing these away. Now, one of the key things that I realized along this journey was my neurodiversity. So when I was young, I was diagnosed with dyslexia, and I was very blessed to have a dad who studied psychology at university. So he was really supportive in helping me to understand why I didn't learn like other people. So in the classical kind of learning formats from reading, writing, visual, audio, kinesthetic doing, for me, listening, terrible, although I have very heightened sense of sensitivity within sound. Kinesthetic, I have a high level of. Visual, I have an incredibly high level of. and reading, writing quite poor. And through this kind of learning process with my dad, I did a lot of aptitude tests. And within the aptitude test, the thing that I was off the chart of was non-numerical patterns. And at the age of like 13 years old, I was thinking, what am I ever going to do with non-numerical patterns? But you'll kind of see how that unfolded as we go along. But it was also linked into this whole element of synesthesia. So these non-numerical patterns, these visual patterns, became my flavors. So I quickly learned that I was able to catalog aromas in my mind and just sit down and write a recipe straight off the bat. And this is something that I've kind of kept with me to this day. The second element of neurodiversity that I actually only realized was only diagnosed with 2 years ago, which is ADHD. And again, I think of all neurodiversities like a fine tool. So if you think about a Japanese knife, hammered steel, folded steel, razor sharp edge, if it's used in the correct way, it's incredibly efficient. If you use it in the wrong way, it'll break and it'll damage. And so this is another aspect of the perfection and chaos that I've realized through my life, is about taking my own nuances and fitting them into the right environments. And this is where this experience from working in a pot wash as a kitchen porter all the way up to this present day has served me well, because the combination of the dyslexia, the highly visual, the pattern recognition, photographic memory, and the ability to file all of these aspects together, coupled with ADHD, which enabled me to very, very quickly assess environments and absorb information very, very quickly. People often describe it, if there was a zombie apocalypse, you want to be in a room with someone with ADHD because they can tell within a couple of seconds what items in the room they would use in order to kind of combat the zombies. So the combination of all these things kind of came together, and all of a sudden it was like, actually, the realization and the acceptance and actually the cherishing of these nuances of myself as kind of my creative superpower. And this is kind of really where, you know, as I kind of moved up the ranks within hospitality industry into management, etc., I then started to move into the world of consulting. And originally I was working for a very, very large corporate company. I had a great mentor, a chap called James Stanley, and I was working for a company called Compass, running all of the internal bars within Diageo from you know, Heathrow Terminal 5 through to St. James's Gate, which is their Guinness brewery. And he took me and he started to use me for different projects. So I opened a bar concept for Michelle Brew Jr. I did the airport lounges for British Airways. And when I left that, I decided that I really wanted to kind of own my own company. And I set up my first agency 13 years ago. And then I joined the team, Alan Gage and Emma Hutchinson, at a company called Sweet and Chili. And I became a partner in that. And we kind of started this off about 12 years ago. Team of us at 17 people, just based in a arch in London Bridge, and kind of grew from there. Originally doing consultancy within the hospitality industry, from people like Anantara Resorts, Deltic, which is the UK's largest nightclub chain, Whitbread, to kind of very, very high-end venues. And then that really developed into the world of brands, because very quickly the likes of Diageo, Red Bull, Bacardi realized that our deep understanding of their customer was very, very good. And I think, like many people that go into the advertising industry, you either kind of have that knack of understanding what might sell or what might hook people onto certain ideas more than others, and you kind of like naturally unfold within your career. So that kind of quickly developed, and it was an incredible journey. We took when I was with Sweet and Chili, we opened up offices in Sydney and LA, and the business is now over 300 people globally. And it's really where I started to kind of spread my wings, really, as a professional and as a creative, because I ultimately found that the higher up that I got, the higher the levels of opportunity there were. And I found that the effectiveness of my craft in its various forms continually expanded. And kind of going back to that point around the journey of your professional career through the perfections and the imperfections, the nuances of my neurodiversity, of these non-numerical patterns, this photographic memory, this hypervigilancy that is the best in a zombie apocalypse. What I really realized was that I was very good at creating customer journeys, because if any of you have watched programs like Chef's Table, you will see the level of detail that goes into these environments. And the difference between like a 1 to a 3 Michelin-starred restaurant is not really something that money can buy. And when I was doing training sessions with bartenders, I was talking about service. I would often tell a story about a friend that went to the Heston Blumenthal's Fat Duck. And she walked into the restaurant and she was met at the reception by the maitre d', who offered her a glass of champagne. She took the champagne, went to meet her friends, had a conversation, was given a canapé. And then when she went to be seated, she sat down at her place and she realized that her cutlery were moved across for a left-handed person. And she is left-handed. And she was shocked because she never told them that she was left-handed. At the end of the meal, she then went up to the maitre d' and said, "How did you know that I was left-handed?" And he said, "Well, when you came in and I offered you a glass of champagne, I noticed you took it with your left hand. I made a mental note of that. Later, when I then came back with a canapé, I then checked it again. I saw you take it up with your left hand. I then overheard your name through our conversation. I went to check where you were sat, and then I went and swapped it." Now, that's the level of detail and understanding of service. And good service is an emotion. It's the creation and curation of someone's emotional experience from when they walk through the door to when they leave that venue. And it should be a beautiful narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end that kind of takes you all the way through. And this was something that I became really, really obsessed about. And for me, the journey really kind of came to a pinnacle when we opened our kind of first flagship bar, which is a bar called 9 Lives in London Bridge. And this is a creative process, was so different to all the work I'd done before. By the time we opened 9 Lives, I'd probably opened in the region of maybe 20 to 25 different venues, like across the world, you know, like 5-star resorts in Dubai, hotels, nightclubs. But I think that there's this kind of really interesting kind of, just thinking about this now, there's an interesting perhaps difference between a creative and an artist. You know, a creative is creating things for other people. You receive a brief, you produce some work, and you give it away. An artist has no brief and they have no client, and they are putting themselves on a piece of paper, on a picture, and that's raw. And it's a very raw experience, and taking part of yourself and putting it into a public domain is a very challenging and rewarding experience. And that's really what happened with 9 Lives. And it's kind of partly where I started to refine a lot of my own creative process. And, you know, I was while I was developing the concept for this, which I produced as a manifesto, a 35-page document that detailed every aspect of the business, from the experience through the door, the drinks, the decor, the glassware, the ethos with the staff, the music policy, etc. I created the manifesto with the intention to create parameters from which I could pass this to the team that were then going to run it, and provide them with the creative space for them to create their own part within it and the ownership of it. And I think this is a really important part of any creative process that's going to produce something that is going to stand the test of time. And a great piece of advice that was given to me by a friend of mine, Simon Strays, who's an architect, who would always say, like, you know, if you're dressing a room, never finish it. You know, like, do 60, 70%, because it almost becomes like a living soul, right? You know, within animism, the religion animism, you know, Shinto in Japan, they talk about how inanimate objects can take on a soul. And it kind of feels like that. And that creation is almost a co-created piece. And it's a co-creation between, you know, within the bar of myself as kind of in the ideation of it, the team in the running of it and the participation of it, and adding the energy into that character, and also the customers. You know, like, how are they using that? What emotion, how does that emotional state that is created for them within that space manifest in how they want to interact with it? And so it was a really, really beautiful and raw experience. And, you know, we kind of came up with 9 lives, and, you know, the ethos behind it was around, you know, being a great neighborhood bar, really, really good drinks, but incredibly casual, right? And it was really like the culmination of all of the great bars that we'd been to in and around the world. You know, and it's still open and doing a roaring trade today, down in London Bridge. So for me, that was really the pinnacle of my career as a hospitality consultant in the creation of this. And it was a little bit of my mic drop. I've not gone back into that area since, but it's something that I'm sure in my later life I'll go back to, because ultimately I think, you know, prior to committing to my career in hospitality, I worked in business development for an IT company in Stevenage. And I vowed never to do that again. I mean, you know, there's an old Japanese proverb, a man that loves his job will never work a day in his life. And I really, I tried to get into it and I really couldn't. And that's when I kind of left and said, I'm going to become a bartender. And everyone went, you're mad. And, but I think, you know, going into it and learning that craft was a really, really important part. And that pot washing was a really important part, because in setting up 9 lives, I had an understanding of every single role within the business. And, you know, I think whether you're an owner of an agency or a hospitality venue, understanding each of those roles is so important. So as I was saying, on from kind of hospitality, I then started to evolve my craft from the making of drinks into the making of products. And one of the things that I really enjoyed and I'm proud of the most is a brand that we developed called Merchant's Heart, which is where I met Pav. And I was approached by an individual from Suntory about the creation of a premium tonic water. And it was to be developed by Suntory in the UK alongside the head of research and development from Schweppes. And Schweppes, as a tonic water, or as a brand, is where it is today because of its ability to retain carbonation. And if you remember when we were talking earlier on about aroma is key to this, because the carbonation lifts the aromatics of the gin and lifts the aromatics of the tonic water up into the nose. And so therefore, to be able to work with this leading food scientist was an incredible privilege. And over a series of, I think, probably 7 or 8 months, we developed this range of mixers. And it was very much based around my synesthesia and the creation of a flavor profile that was mindful of what you want to get out of spirits. And what I mean by that is flavors have a beginning, middle, and an end. You'll hear about perfumists talk about top notes, beginning, middle notes, middle, base notes, ending. And it's like a story. So you want the top notes to introduce you to the flavors. You don't want them to be too bold and brash, and you want them to kind of build up into these middle notes that then provide you with some interesting kind of little twists and turns, and then the base notes that gently let you down. And great food and great drink should be a long and complex story, right? And the difference between a 30-pound bottle of whiskey and a 3,000-pound bottle of whiskey is fundamentally this. It is how long and complex that flavor is. So when we created Merchant's Heart, we created this with the middle notes missing. And the reason for this is that the middle notes of spirits are the preferable ones. Ultimately, the majority of cocktails contain sweet and sour, and that balance of sweet and sour helps to cut the burn of the alcohol. So think about if you pour a vodka or an orange, that sweetness removes the burn. If you have a shot of tequila and slice of lime, that lime cuts the burn of it. Although I would recommend, if you do a shot of tequila and you need something afterwards, have a glass of apple juice, because you'll then get all the great flavor from the agave, but at the same time cut that burn. So that's what we created within Merchant's Heart. And I think it was a really interesting project to work on because of the brand manager's kind of creative drive. A guy called Jason Sennett, who was working with Suntory, and we really kind of set about differentiating this brand through unique ways. And how could we cut through what was quite a crowded market at that particular time with kind of Fever-Tree pushing ahead? And the decision was made that we would do this by creating our own magazine called Campi. And I think you get these certain projects on your life where you get to work with the dream team. And, naturally, Pav was on that dream team. And we had this incredible group of people from ex-editors of Time Out. And we worked with a plethora of incredible editors, writers, and photographers, and created something very, very special. And we did, each of the magazines that we produced had a range of different themes. On the kind of the bottom left-hand side, you can see the image with the martini glass. This was around the Japanese issue, and we did a photo shoot around cocktails where I created a series of drinks which were based around the 9 Japanese aesthetics, the 9 Japanese definitions of beauty. Down the bottom there, in the blue, this was the future issue. So this was the evolution of the pina colada from the original on the left-hand side in the hurricane glass, all the way through to a futuristic floating bubble with a kind of a coconut smoke around it. And then on the top, we've got a great photography from the world issue, which is where we kind of had a great article about all of the weird and wonderful alcohols that different people around the world drink. So it was an incredibly exciting project to work on. And I think for me, the thing that I really enjoyed was working with incredibly talented creatives in different disciplines. So working with incredible set designers and incredible photographers and incredible writers. And we sit down at these kind of almost little like board meetings, kind of come up with all these concepts. And I think it's really interesting when you have a specialist in each area, how quickly things can evolve, right? And it's that kind of cooperation between those different individuals. And, you kind of get into that creative flow state, and things can kind of just bounce around super quick, and you come up with things that are really exciting. So one of my really favorite projects to work on as a creator, both in terms of the creation of the products, but also what happened afterwards. And interestingly enough, the creation of this magazine was a key aspect in securing listing in Sainsbury's for the brand. So it's quite interesting when you work with brands that have the ability and the desire to think outside the box and the results that can then deliver. Now, another interesting kind of part of my own personal development was working on a very large project called World Class, which is a global, basically the global equivalent of MasterChef. So this is done across 60 countries across the world by Diageo, and is a global competition where one winner from each of those countries comes to a single location, be it Mexico City, Miami, Cape Town, and competes. And my role within this was as challenge director initially, where I would develop the challenges which the competitors would compete within, and then to run this as a project. And the really interesting thing for this was, as a kind of a creative, but also a craftsperson, what I found very interesting was having exposure to 60 of the best individuals from around the world and going to each of these locations, and the change in perspective that you get by seeing how someone else does what you do in a different country, I found incredibly enriching. And, you know, I'm very passionate about music, and I find it so interesting to listen to different people's interpretations of certain musics. You know, like I listen to, you know, a lot of like rock and roll from the 60s and 70s, but from Morocco, which is really interesting when they were listening to these tapes and kind of taking their own interpretation of it. So this process of developing kind of the competition of World Class was really interesting. And it then led into one of the other pivotal moments in my professional career and the development of that, which was the creation of something called World Class Studios. And World Class Studios was a training program which was designed for the top 1% of the bartending industry. And of course, when you're at the upper echelons of your industry, you need to go into lateral categories. So we worked with individuals such as, you know, Brett, the head chef from the Ledbury. We worked with culinary scientists. We worked with Professor Charles Spence, who's a professor of experimental psychology at Oxford. So his role is to, if I say to you Magnum ice creams, I'm pretty sure that each of you can hear the sound of that chocolate crunching in your mind. That is designed to sound like that. And in this process of creating world-class studios, we would spend 9 months of the year with a team researching about a specific topic, be it culinary science, psychology, or flavor. And it introduced me to the perspective of looking at my creative process in more of a four-dimensional way. So I'd gone from creating drinks to creating a person's experience with me at the bar, to creating a whole experience within a venue, to then looking at that in a multi-dimensional way. So what do people smell? What do people see? What do people feel? And then within this process, what I call chunking up and chunking down. So looking at the biology of flavor, right? And how we smell and taste. And I'll give you an example about why this is important, because when you smell something, there are two forms. There's retronasal and orthonasal. Orthonasal is through the nose, and retronasal is through the back of the palate. So if I said to you something like blue cheese, it smells like old socks, but when you taste it in your mouth and it comes up through the back of your palate, it tastes creamy and salty. So within my creative process, I then started to look at my world very, very differently, from really looking at it on a very, very small microscopic level. And this little diagram we've got on the bottom left-hand side is the flavor breakdown and chemical composition of a green chili. And having looked at kind of the science of how we taste and smell, I then started to explore the science of flavor. And this is where I started to become really, really fascinated. And again, the neurodiversity and the creation of patterns. So this is a diagram of flavor pairings. And the flavor pairings are dictated by similar or matching volatile flavor molecules. So essentially, everything that tastes good together has similar molecules. So if you imagine a molecule a little bit like Tetris, so if they have similar Tetris pieces, they'll taste great together. So that might be something like oysters and parsley, or white chocolate and caviar, or mango and pine, or white chocolate, pink grapefruit, and passion fruit. So all of these share volatile flavor molecules. And I found this really, really fascinating. And I was actually having a conversation, with one of my designers the other day who, as a designer, started to go into kind of almost a academic rant, to be honest, about font sizes and structure on a page. And I think it's really interesting within this kind of creative process about when you kind of expand out and look at it from a big picture and down to a very, very minute picture as well. Now, this really then kind of started to get my head spinning. And I then became very, very obsessed around multi-sensory experiences and using sight, sound, touch, smell, taste to curate someone's emotional state through various different environments. And one of the incredible pieces of work that I did for a couple of years was with an incredible woman who's on the top right corner called Emily Baltz. So Emily Baltz is she would kind of describe herself as a scientist crossed with Willy Wonka, and she creates immersive food and drinking experiences. And we worked on a series of projects for Red Bull Global. And with Red Bull Global, they would provide us with very abstract briefs. So, for example, one of the briefs was to evoke a childlike sense of play without referencing anything childlike. And they gave us a whole hotel in Antwerp where we were able to create dining rooms that were fully immersive. We evoked a childlike sense of play by converting one of the hotel rooms into a ball pit. So you open the door and watching adults instantaneously revert to that childlike state through the experiencing of seeing something that they saw from being a young child. So it was a really, really interesting, we did this for a large project at Tomorrowland in Brussels, and for ADE, which was all around restoration for all of the people that are coming in. So using kind of like these multi-sensory environments and emotional anchors. And I think emotional anchors are such an interesting kind of weapon in a creative arsenal, and something that often lies subconsciously. An example of this is they did a little bit of research into a spike in popularity of Diet Coke within a specific age demographic. And what they realized was the fact that the Diet Coke contained the same sweetener as Robinson's barley water. So those, young professionals sat at their desks who were drinking Diet Coke had drunk Robinson's barley water when they were younger. So therefore they had developed this emotional anchor of comfort to that flavor profile and attached it. And, this is something that myself and Emily really, really worked quite heavily on, and utilizing very small kind of triggers to provide people to evoke certain emotional states within them via smell, via taste, via touch, via sound. So for me, this was kind of, you know, as I said, a really, really beautiful experience of kind of taking everything I learned in the curation of people's emotional states and kind of taking it into the highest possible level. I had a Jerry Maguire moment. I became a dad. I said, what am I doing with my life? What positive benefit am I having? And I then basically kind of started to think about this in the Japanese kind of belief of Akagi, about like, how can I bring all this together? And also on that kind of item on the right hand side is animism. So I became really interested about the kind of exchange of energy, right? And it's, you know, it's animism being a pre-Abrahamic religion and belief system, that there's an energy all around us, and it's all an energy exchange, and the realization that's what I've been doing my whole life. From there, this is really where I took everything that I had learned from day dot to present day to create Ace and Freak. And what I wanted to do was, in quite an animistic sort of way, to create a little element of positive intention to share with people and not have to force this upon them. So to take, you know, good intention, and what I talk about is the 4 Ps. So planet, people, profit, but also palette, and creating something that was packaged in a way just to kind of create this little bit of a positive intention. And that's kind of really where the business started. We launched it in 2018. We call it a hard juice. It's the evolution of the classic RTD, but made with very high quality ingredients. So pressed juice, craft spirits, and soda water. And it's really designed to be this little capsule of good intention. Everything that we've been doing thus far is quite under the layers of the external. Is very, very complex. So taking everything that I learned with culinary science and psychology of flavor and kind of putting it into this small can. So the cans themselves are fully textured, which evokes kind of like a perception of quality. The designing on the outside, created by Sam Muir, is quite specifically minimalistic. So when people see it on the shelf, it really, you know, promotes intrigue. They then pick that up. That level of texture they get in their hand then conveys a perception of quality. They then turn this around. They open the can. The way that we've created the product, so we have what we call a botanical spirit. So I work with a distiller to distill a range of different botanicals into that liquid. So when people open that can, the orthonasal aroma is incredible and very, very unique, and is what I call a retrofitted flavor. So for example, one of our flavors is watermelon, which is highly volatile and doesn't work unless you chill, store it, or highly process it. But we've recreated a fresh watermelon flavor using natural ingredients by kind of just taking all that understanding of culinary science into it. So this is probably the thing that I'm most proud of. You know, it's kind of taken all of the sustainability best practice, which I learned from within Diageo, an ethical element where we bake in like a fixed charity donation to the product, because ultimately that shouldn't be a headline banner. It should be a standard, so that we can kind of lead part of the change that we want to see in the world. And likewise, you know, the name Ace and Freak comes from the fact that there's an ace in all of us and there's a freak in all of us. But ultimately, in today's day and age, there are the haves and the have-nots. And one of the biggest issues that we have is in around what we eat. You know, the World Health Organization now says that processed foods is more damaging to your health than smoking. Let that sink in. Like, what we eat is more damaging to our health than smoking. And based upon their classification of foods, if you go into a US supermarket, 74% of the food that's in there is not classified based upon nutritional content as a food. So, you know, this is the intention with Ace and Freak, is to make something that's high quality, that's accessible, that's not overly priced to everyone. So while kind of delivering some positive impact. So yeah, that's my story of me.
We've got, was it 5 minutes left? 6 minutes left, maybe? Does anyone have any questions? If not, I've got a couple of really nice, easy ones.
You can, if you need, recipes, flavors.
Yeah, hi. I want to say thank you for that talk. It was so good. It was really insightful. It's interesting because you brought up yourself being dyslexic. I'm also dyslexic. But then what I thought was really interesting is you had that diagram which showed that as flavour enters the mouth, also the trigger stuff in the brain.
Yeah.
Do you think being dyslexic could change the way you read profiles and flavours?
Yes. Ultimately, if you think about a deaf person, right? Sorry, a blind person, like a lot of blind people are piano tuners. So there's a heightened sense of a particular sense in them. One of the things that I've realized that with my dyslexia, I have a super heightened sense of hearing. If anyone talks to me while I'm trying to do something, it completely disables me. So I think potentially, depending upon the individual, it could do, because also if that element of synesthesia, depending on dyslexia, because it's a more of a visual learning kind of process, there is the potential to do it. I would also say that there are what are referred to as super tasters. So some people have got a heightened sense of taste, and what they do is they do a test where they give you a piece of paper and you put it on your tongue, and for some people it's incredibly bitter, and for some people they can't taste it. So there is the potential that your neurodiversity might increase that.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, what is your favorite flavor and aroma after all of this journey, if you are able to choose one?
Can you give me some context? Like, what time of day is it? What am I doing? I mean, this is why I go really niche.
It's 6 in the morning. Yeah, just walked out of bowl.
Yeah. Do you know what? Like,
What's the first thing getting after party?
First thing after party. I mean, I'll tell you. Okay, so favorite. Do you know what? Do you know what my favorite smell is? And this is gonna be really weird, but it's quite telling. Is the smell of rain on hot ground. And the reason is because it reminds me of growing up in Spain. And your aromatic memories are your earliest, right? So that's probably my favorite smell. My favorite taste is, what is my favorite taste? Do you know what? Like, it would probably be something like quite simple and quite fresh. I really love cucumber and water. So literally get a cucumber and like peel it with a potato peel and put that in. And the interesting thing with water is that it will never take the aromatics. So there's a positive and negative element to it. So it will never get you the aroma and taste. It just takes taste. I quite like really light, subtle flavors. And if you do that with cucumber and then carbonate it so it lifts up the flavor, you carbonate it as well, you'll get what's called carbolic acid. So it'll become a little bit acidic from the dissolving of the carbon dioxide. That's.
And Tom, you might have a better one than this, but I was always really fascinated by the origin stories of certain cocktails.
Yeah.
And the one that I really remember is how the espresso martini was created.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, the espresso martini is a good one. I think ultimately there's often, as with every creation story, there's the legends.
Yeah,
and
go with the legends.
I like to stick with the legends. So the story is that once upon a time in Notting Hill, there was a famous restaurant called Pharmacy, which was designed by Damien Hirst. And it was back in the day when Gaza was hanging out with Damien Albarn and all those guys, and it was Britpop, and they'd all just go hammered, and then Gaza would go play football. But the head bartender there was a guy called Dick Bradsell. Now, Dick Bradsell was incredible. He invented, the espresso martini, the Bramble. He invented a plethora of incredible modern classics. Very interesting character. Ended his days working in Soho, cross-dresser. He worked at a place called the Connolly Rooms, which is the place where people that get banned from the Groucho Club go. And the story is that one day Naomi Campbell walked into the bar and asked for a drink to wake her up and fuck her up. And so therefore Dick produced the espresso martini, which was originally called a pharmaceutical stimulant. And it is quite interesting. And you know, it's that combination of caffeine and alcohol. You know, caffeine, which increases the motor neuron response rate when you drink it with alcohol, and alcohol, which removes the anxiety of the caffeine. You know, so it's this little balance of yin and yang going on there.
Yeah.
I have another question. I was just thinking when you were talking about sort of the flavors and stuff like that, and you know, sort of globalization of sort of alcohol and like different drinks around the world. Does location affect, I guess, the market for certain drinks, and I guess maybe the palate? Because I guess there's certain drinks I think of, like Negroni, like most people I know, like wherever they're from. But how much does like locale play into flavor profiles?
A huge amount. A huge amount. And actually, this is one of the things, I think one of the interesting things when I was talking about like working with these 60 countries from all over the world, but also working with, you know, going from national brand teams to global brand teams to, you know, working, you know, within innovation groups within Africa with Diageo, right? So, you know, even the difference between West Africa to East Africa, you know, if you look at global flavor profiles, you can really start to understand it by its culinary cuisine, right? So say, for example, if you look at the difference between Japan and China, right? So Japanese like food is very soft, it's very subtle, right? In terms of sensitivity of flavor, the Japanese have one of the highest levels of sensitivity of flavor because they don't have highly spiced food. If you go to China, you know, go to Szechuan, everything's incredibly spicy, right? If you go to Africa, for example, and try one of their hot sauces, like game over, right? But, you know, and it's interesting about how all over the world, and again, it links into levels of sweetness. The enjoyment of bitter is a very European thing. So if you take your 5 tastes, sweet, sour, bitter, salt, umami, sweet, salt, umami are biologically pre-programmed flavor preferences. If you take a newborn baby and you put some sugar water on their lips, you take some salt water on their lips, or you take some umami flavor like monosodium glutamate and put that on their lips, they'll lick it. Sour and bitter, you are biologically pre-programmed to dislike. The reason why a child, when they put like some rocket in their mouth, goes like that, is because we're trying to spit it out. You know, we can taste 1 in 300 parts of sweet, but 1 in 3 million parts of bitter. So the reason we like bitter is because we like to skate on the edge and we learn to like it. And it's a very, very European thing. So it is starting to spread out. Like, you know, like it started to become a big trend in Brazil, for example, but it was more something that they had to train their palates to like. But likewise, you know, if you go to, you know, you might have like a sweet tea in Asia and the level of condensed milk in it is just far too much, right? Or if you've ever been to a Miami and had a Colombian coffee, right? I mean, it's like, there's so much sugar in it. It's like a syrup, right? So it's just those little flavor preferences, which then link into how someone grows up, what is consumed within that.
That's really cool.
Amazing. Mate, we'll wrap it up there and let you go. But thank you so much for that, mate. Really appreciate it. It was super interesting. And time, mate. Really appreciate it.
Welcome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks. Bye.